How long will it take before Donald Trump finally runs out of patience and floods Ukraine with military aid? I just can't comprehend it. Well, patience was written in quotation marks. There are still all sorts of explanations claiming that this is just his usual negotiation style. I can always come up with a scenario explaining why all of this is part of a brilliant plan. But as long as I am not deeply convinced of it myself, I don't want to do that, because I don't want to give the impression that I'm naive or an apologist for his behavior. In the end, what Piers Morgan said remains. Let's look at what he does, not what he says. And what he's done is, ever since the commodity agreement was reached, aid for Ukraine has been increasing. Since then, there have been arms sales and new deliveries are being initiated, even if they are no longer funded by American taxpayers, at least not directly. Part of this is probably financed through the commodity fund, so that the arms deliveries, which are effectively paid for by taxpayers, are offset in such a way that, in theory, the money is eventually reimbursed. But since the commodity agreement, aid to Ukraine has been increasing again. Apparently, ATACMS were also delivered. At least that's what could be gathered from the reports, even though I haven't noticed any significant operations involving them. In the end, we'll just have to wait and see what he does. That's why I don't put any stock in the fact that Donald Trump applauded while Vladimir Putin approached him, that he smiled at him, or that he touched him on the back. All these things that people are currently making a big deal out of, while conveniently ignoring that Obama did some of these things as well, at least part of this behavior, and so on and so forth. That's what I focus on. What we can see from the current meeting is that there is no longer a demand for an immediate ceasefire, that there are no penalties because there was no deal reached during this meeting, and that the statement now suggests that a ceasefire is no longer even being pursued. These are things that are current politics. If we ignore everything else around it, what is said, what is shown, the gestures, then these three things remain. And these three things are in Russia's favor. Anyone who wants to can work through the rest. I'm not interested in that. But these three things remain. So is there anything else coming? I've outlined it often enough. Russia will only stop pursuing its maximal goals if it is forced to do so. And that could be militarily, but it could also be economically. But as long as it is not forced, Russia has no reason to abandon its maximal goals, because the domestic population is supporting the war. At the front, they are advancing, and the government obviously has no problem with the losses suffered. So why should they give up? That means the goal remains regime change and the conquest of territory. Russia will have to be forced to do that. And so far, the US is not willing to do so, but we also have to be clear, the Europeans are not willing either. Because the European economic area is not much smaller, especially with the UK and Norway, it's really not smaller than the US. They could also impose secondary sanctions, but they continue to eagerly buy oil and gas from Russia. In 2024, more money was transferred to Russia for hydrocarbons than was provided to Ukraine in aid. That's the whole truth. Now, there are reasons for this, because if the German federal government were to block every delivery within Germany, as well as to other EU countries, the economy would falter and then the AfD would win. Not just 20-something%, but suddenly 35 or even 40%. And the same could happen in other countries as well. But there is no free lunch. Nothing comes for free. If you want to stop the Russians, it's going to cost something. And it will either cost money for weapons, or it will cost economic output, which is also money, or it will cost German soldiers, and at least for now, that's neither desired nor an option. That means, one way or another, the Russians currently have no reason to hold back because the home front is holding, for now at least, and things are moving forward at the front. So, when others will run out of patience to the extent that the Russians are stopped is anyone's guess. That's the problem. But as I said, we can point at Trump, and let's go ahead and do that. Trump should be criticized, and he does plenty that deserves criticism, but since the end of 22, or at the latest by mid-23, I have repeatedly emphasized that the war in Ukraine is a European war. For a voter in Alabama, whether Ukraine is subjugated by Russia is probably not of the greatest importance, but for a voter in Poland, it certainly is. And actually, it should be for voters in Bavaria or Saxony as well. That means it's not as if Germany is at its limit with what it can do, or that Europe is at its limit. So by all means criticize the Americans, but we're also not exactly setting the best example ourselves. That too should be stated openly. Because would Europe be able to put enough pressure on the Russians to force them to abandon their maximal objectives? I believe so. I don't see why not. Economically, in terms of population and also in terms of industry, Europe has great capabilities. Europe would be able to do it, but it doesn't come for free, and Europe simply doesn't want to pay that price.